does amazes me. I also should have listened to him before I put this presentation together, because that's the only picture in the presentation. The rest of it is death by PowerPoint. Unfortunately, granting money is kind of dry in many cases. I did want to point out, since I tend to like to start with that picture, Frank Bauer was talking about being able to use GPS from Earth for the navigation to land that lander on the moon. On AO40, those are the GPS antennas, 4 of them, that Frank's group at NASA Goddard provided to AMSAT to fly on the satellite, where from 60,000 kilometers, we were able to look back at the Earth and receive GPS signals. And not only that, we were able to map the side lobes of those helix antennas on the GPS satellites and prove, but all that data went to Frank and his group, of course, and prove that you could, for the first time, navigate using GPS from above the constellation, because you're seeing the satellites around the other side of the Earth. And where is that now? Everybody in orbit navigates with GPS, right? Okay, so ARDC. I'm fairly new to ARDC. I joined the Grants Advisory Committee just about a year ago, but I just want to talk with you for 20 minutes or so about what the ARDC Foundation is, what it does, give you just a brief history, which is really kind of fascinating, describe our mission, vision, the strategies, but then I want to focus in on priority areas for funding that were developed earlier this year, and especially those related to space. And we'll talk a little bit about how to apply, how you get your application in. So the ARDC Foundation, it's a private foundation, it is a 501c3, and it was created for the purpose of promoting amateur radio and promoting digital communications. So the areas that we focus on are learning, experimenting, and doing, and I'll define those a little more in a second. But keep those in mind, learning, experimenting, and doing. In addition to that, we manage 44net. So any address, any IP address starting with 44, except for the ones that we no longer own, are dedicated for use in amateur radio. So there's about 12 million of those addresses that are available. If you're doing an amateur radio project, you need IP addresses. These are available for you to apply for, and there's a whole process for doing that that's defined on the website. Excuse me, the bottom line is, because we have a fairly substantial endowment, we are able to grant out between $3 and $5 million a year on average for amateur radio or digital communications projects. So let me explain this intersection between amateur radio and digital communications. If you look at our logo down at the bottom, you'll see there's a bar in between the AR and the DC. This is B. Dale Garby, came up with this. That is a logical inclusive OR symbol, okay? And I love B. Dale for it. B. Dale's my good friend, but it's confusing to many people, so let me explain it. We work in the area of amateur radio. We also work in the area of digital communications. We work each of those individually, but also at the intersection between those two. So the point here is that a project, an application that you apply for funding for, does not need to be digital. It can be pure amateur radio, okay? Or it can be pure digital that doesn't involve amateur radio, as long as it meets the other criteria that we're concerned about, you know, open source, etc. Or it can be both. So amateur radio or digital communications, either or both. So a brief history, a kind of an amazing story really. In 1981, there was a thing called ARPANET, and Hank Manguski was one of the guys who was dabbling in this business of what do we do with this address space in this thing that we have invented called the IPv4 addressings, right? IPv4 is what we're all familiar with, 192.168.1.1, that's an IPv4 address, right? In 1981, ARPANET was slicing up those addresses and allocating them to different uses. And we were beginning to experiment, we hams, Phil Karn and others, with packet radio. And the guys who are really into this are looking at what's happening in the internet world, and they're saying, you know, we could do that also, we kind of already are. So Hank Manguski called up the guy who was allocating the IP addresses, and he said, hey, you know, hams are kind of working in this area, can we have some addresses? And he got 44 anything assigned to amateur radio forever, right? In that day, there were 12 billion addresses, as I recall, and in those days, nobody believed that the world would ever use all of those, so this was an okay thing, right? In the process of doing that, then they had to put together an organization to manage those addresses. So Hank and some others put together AMPERNet as the loose organization of volunteers to manage the addresses, to give them out to people. In 2011, things got a little more complex, and ARDC, or as an organization, was formed to be the trustee of the 44net addresses. Brian Cantor, of course, was a big part of that. In 2019, Brian and the other folks involved recognized there was a real sweet spot here because IPv6 was coming, which has, I don't even know what the right term is, 100 big Katillion addresses, right? More than the world will ever use. We've heard that before. And IPv4 addresses, however, IPv6 was not fully adopted yet. It was not available in many places. So IPv4 addresses were worth a lot of money because at the same time all that was happening, there were some of these companies building all sorts of cloud and web services, and they really needed IPv4 addresses. So these guys said, there's an opportunity here, and they sold off a third of the addresses and created the endowment that now funds ARDC Foundation and funds projects. There was, right after that happened, Brian unfortunately passed away, so the other folks that were involved in that, B. Dale and Phil and some other folks, had to put together fairly quickly a set of processes to give away 5% on average of that endowment every year. That's the IRS rules for charitable foundations. So they did that. They had recognized pretty quickly they needed to put together a little bit of a staff. I think we have 8 paid on the staff now. It's a very slim organization. The majority of the people that do the work are volunteers. But when you're dealing with these sorts of sums of money and you have to stay straight with the IRS and everything, you do need a little bit of a paid staff. So that happened on through 2020, and that is the organization today. So some statistics from 2019 to 24, we gave out 315 grants totaling about 30 million and impacted by, I think, a fairly conservative view, over 94,000 people directly impacted by those grants. If you look at the annual reports and all of this stuff the audit, everything is on the website. In 2024, there were 198 proposals submitted, 59 were funded, and about 3 million, a little over 3 million was distributed. So this is really dry, but this is the basis on which ARDC operates. The mission, I'm not going to read it, but it's all about enhancing, promoting amateur radio and or digital communications in all of those areas. It's about open access, innovation, education, and enhancing communication technologies. Our 3 strategies, and we kind of tend to bucket grant applications that come to us into one of these 3 buckets, although there's often quite a bit of crossover: promoting learning, experimenting, and doing. So what's learning? It's getting more people educated, learning about AR and DC. So obviously that's STEM education, all the kinds of things Frank was just talking about, all the way up through universities, university CubeSat projects, university curriculum, etc. Experimenting is all about R&D. We have funded some fairly substantial R&D projects, for example, having to do with digital voice. Amazing what those folks are doing with digital voice. If you haven't seen those demos, you should. So we've seen all sorts of very interesting R&D projects. And then promoting doing. Doing is operating. And the objective is to get more people involved in using more different bands and modes and technologies. So the kinds of things that fall under that category are emergency communications trailers, rebuilding club stations, rebuilding repeaters and rehabbing and new repeaters and networks and those sorts of things. So there are some other parameters that we have to deal with, of course, and that is that we will not fund anything that is a gatekeeper technology where you have to be licensed or a member of a group or something to participate in that technology. We are looking for the broadest possible impact, not something serving just a single group of people. We like things that aren't likely to be funded by other sources, and especially in the digital communications part, it does not necessarily have to be wireless. If somebody came along with a really interesting, advanced, the state-of-the-art wireline digital R&D project, for example, we would take a look at that. So earlier this year, the board of directors got together and formulated some priority areas of funding. And the idea here was to make it a little bit clearer the kinds of things that, as B. Dale says, are interesting to us. So in the R&D area, we are looking at, of course, open source solutions. You can see the list there. Imagine, we all know what the RTL dongle does for receive, right? Imagine something like that for transmit. The same sort of thing. There are a few out there. I run one on a ground station that I lease out to universities, an LSB 200, but it's expensive, very expensive. Open source education means curriculum and the kinds of things Frank was talking about, developing curriculum and then putting that out in the public so that it's available for anybody to adopt. And that can take all those forms that you see there. And then in the area of space-based communications, I want to talk a little bit more about. Let me just jump ahead to the next slide. So an area of interest here, a priority area of interest, is higher orbits. And that can be highly elliptical or geo. I really think it would be cool to go to the moon, but I understand the difficulties involved in that. So geosyncs, hosted payloads on a geosync bird, standalone geosync, anything that gets us more coverage and more bandwidth would be an area of interest for ARDC. A little more specific, That could be repurposing commercial birds, it could be hosted payloads, and then of course, educational initiatives that use space. Some of the ARDC things that Frank was talking about, it just amazes me what ARDC has done over the years. That falls right into our area of interest. So just a quick look, a couple of slides of space projects that we have funded. You'll see these are pretty international. There is the Pathways to Space there, which is teaching teachers about space so they can teach it. Some CubeSats built by students around the world. Here's some more. Here's, of course, the one for AMSAT NA. The Birds X CubeSat and Kyushu. So you can see it's a variety of things, both educational and space-based. Now, these were all granted before the board readjusted those areas of interest. So we're looking for higher orbits now. If somebody came along with a grant request for a package to fly in LEO, say in a CubeSat, in order to qualify it for a higher orbit, in my view, I'm just one vote on the grant advisory committee, but in my view, that's something that we would take a look at. So, only 2 more slides here, I think. How do you apply for a grant? First of all, to be eligible, you got to be a nonprofit. These are the IRS rules, right? We're a nonprofit. We can only give to other nonprofits or government agencies, schools, universities. It includes clubs that are 501c3s. Certainly it can include individuals if they partner with that club, international groups. International folks that we have looked at have different rules, sort of, to define what a nonprofit is, but you still have to be a nonprofit. And we are not willing and interested in granting money to businesses or for-profit organizations. So if you're interested in applying, by all means go to grants.ardc.net, you click apply, it'll take you through the list of things that you need and the information that you need to provide. The way we work is we receive grants quarterly. At the end of the quarter, then the grants advisory committee, there's about a dozen of us. We look at all these. It takes about another quarter to look at them and make a determination as to whether we will recommend them to the board or not. And at the end of the quarter, we send that list over to the ARDC board and they make the final decisions. So here's some contacts. Back to 44net. Adam's address there is if you're interested in a 44net address. These are all at ardc.net. All that information is. But here's where you would find that sort of thing. So in summary then, the QR code there, I highly recommend. Our media people did what I think is an absolutely fantastic video. It's not very long. It is how ARDC and how 44net came to be, the history of it, in the faces and the voices of the people that were involved. I think it's a fantastic video. So in summary then, we're all about promoting amateur radio in the areas of learning, experimenting, and doing. And I'd be glad to answer any questions that you have.
All right, Jim, thank you very much. Since I had the microphone, let me be the first question. Number one, I want to thank ARDC. You guys do great work, funded some great projects. I enjoy watching the project award announcements. Some great stuff going on there. But I've seen different, I've heard different things. Open access versus open source, and does it matter? I believe originally on the initial publication, it required it to be at least open access, which has a different definition than open source.
I think that's a difference without a distinction.
Okay.
whatever it is has got to be open. So anybody
Gotcha.
can use it, anybody can take it and implement it. Doesn't necessarily mean that the code has to be open source, although B. Dale would probably argue with me about that since he is the god of open source, right? Yeah, I don't know that there's that much difference, Robert. The whole idea is we are not interested in funding things that then become a closed system that people can't use.
Thank you. Next question, anybody? Oh, come on. All right. Thank you so
All
much.
right, thank you all.
Yeah, appreciate you coming down.